And joining me now is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg. Mayor Buttigieg, welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I want to start with sort of the news of the moment that we're all dealing with as a country here, what's going on in the Middle East. Do you believe the administration has provided enough proof that Iran was indeed behind these tanker attacks?
Well, I think what we've seen is compelling. There seems to be more information that we haven't had a chance to see. It's a little distressing to think that because this administration's credibility is so low in general, I think a lot of people are thinking twice at a moment when America's word should be decisive. When the U.S. says this is something that has happened and this is the consensus of our administration, that should be something that goes without question. But of course, that's just not the case in an administration that has been extremely unreliable in so many ways. That being said, this is not inconsistent with Iranian behavior that has been aggressive and often malignant in the region. The real question is, what can we do, given the facts on the ground, to ensure a measured response that will de-escalate rather than inflame tensions in the region?
Well, what is that measured response that a President Buttigieg would do at this point? I mean, I know you want to go back into the nuclear agreement, but the nuclear agreement did nothing about the belligerent behavior of Iran. So what would you be doing?
Well, the first thing is we would be consulting and coordinating with our allies. I think everybody has an interest in the region becoming more stable.
But let me pause you there. Our
less.
Closest allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Israel in particular, they seem to be in a different place on Iran than the United States even.
Well, our allies in the Middle East are going to be concerned first and foremost with their own security. We need to make sure that we have tensions de-escalate rather than escalate when it comes to what's going on there. But what we see out of the White House is something disturbingly reminiscent of the kind of accelerating drumbeat that got us into the war in Iraq. Worse, it's got some of the same cast of characters. I'm still mystified that John Bolton, who was one of the architects of the Iraq conflict, is said to be behind a lot of the administration's policy on Iran as well. And it's not only allies in the region, but allies across the globe who have an interest in stopping any pathway toward the Middle East becoming any more violent, any more unstable than it already is.
Do you take comfort at all that President Trump appears to be more dovish about this than John Bolton?
Well, the president has said that he does not want a conflict. Of course, it's very difficult to take the president at his word anytime he says anything. But to the extent that we believe him, the real question is a dynamic underway in the administration, just as much as in the Middle East, that could get out from the control of the president himself. Right. I'm concerned about that, and it's one more reason why we need stable leadership in the United States and a stable international community where our alliances are steady and our word is taken seriously. At
a minimum, do you think it's appropriate? Would it be appropriate if they had the U.S. military essentially in the Gulf of Oman as essentially as a police escort for these tankers? Do you think that's a necessary step? Okay.
Yes, it could certainly be appropriate for U.S. To use our sea power to make sure that there is safety and freedom of passage in that part of the world that's so vital to the world economy.
I want to move to you gave a big foreign policy speech. One thing that I was interested in hearing about, because I didn't quite make it out in your speech, is whether you believe, number one, that the American military should be or is a tool to deal with another country's human rights violations. And what is that line? For instance, Venezuela.
So I don't believe that Venezuela calls for American military intervention. I think what we need to do there is apply the range of other American diplomatic and economic tools in order to promote a good outcome.
That means do you like what the administration has pushed so far has been appropriate in your mind?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that the regime there has lost its legitimacy, and I also believe that we need to move toward democracy there. Where I'm a little more concerned is the seemingly casual references to the idea that we might commit U.S. military troops in order to deal with that situation. It is conceivable that U.S. troops might be involved in international peacekeeping operations or some other kind of lawful, internationally legitimate intervention in a situation like the Rwandan genocide. But when we have cases around the world, as we will and as we do, of things going on in a country that we don't like, there are a lot of steps between here and a military intervention, and we should only intervene militarily when we're convinced that there is no reasonable alternative.
The biggest criticism of American foreign policy over the years has been we selectively apply our values. So, for instance, on human rights, we have one set of values we apply to Saudi Arabia, another set of values we apply to Cuba, another set of values we apply to China. Are you going to try to square all of those positions of the United States, and do you think we should apply it in one way, or do you have to realpolitik this a little bit? Obviously, Saudi Arabia can impact the American economy, ditto with China, Cuba less so.
I think the world needs America to live up to our values and to speak for democracy and human rights in a way that's much more consistent than we've seen in recent years. Obviously, every case has its own complexities and its own dynamics, but at the end of the day, so much depends on whether America is a convincing beacon of things like freedom and democracy. And I do believe that puts us at odds with China. It's one reason why it's important that our model look more competitive than it does today. See, right now, because America looks so chaotic and because of our internal divisions, the Chinese model is being held up as an alternative. But most of us don't want to live in the kind of techno-authoritarianism that China is building toward. So we need to be a little more convincing, not just in our consistency abroad, but frankly in our commitment to democracy at home. As long as we see a president who is fomenting xenophobia, who is calling critical press coverage fake news, and a Republican Party that seems to think nothing of making it more difficult for Americans to exercise their democratic rights and vote as part of a political strategy, it's going to be very difficult for us to be convincing about democracy anywhere we go.
What about Saudi Arabia and the fact and how they treat women?
I believe that when you see things like the killing, the execution and torture of dissidents, that is wrong on either side of the Gulf. And this should be a factor in the way we deal with Saudi Arabia. We have a close relationship in many regards. We should consider putting the brakes on that relationship at a moment when, again, our values are being called into question because the president seems to think that a pending arms deal is more important than speaking up about the fact that an American resident, a journalist, was killed and dismembered. No two countries are the same, but we need, especially when we're talking about an ally where we might have some leverage, to stand up for human rights and the things we believe in as a country.
You're obviously making a generational argument during this campaign, being the youngest contender in this race, or sort of the youngest top-tier contender in this race. It's an obvious thing for you to do. Let me ask this question about Joe Biden that you've been sort of ducking all week long. What can Joe Biden do to you to convince you that he's future-oriented?
Look, I think every one of us is running our own playbook, and I think a candidate of any age could speak about the future. But I think not every candidate is doing that. And the future can't just be a kind of bumper sticker word or some vague idea we throw out there. I want us to be forming policies today that are going to make sense in the 2050s, that we're going to be able to look back.
Do you think somebody in their 70s, can't have a good vision of what 2050 is going to look like in America?
Of course they can, but I think I have the best one, and my plan is to go out and compete with it.
That's a fair point there. Let me ask you this about the president's comments having to do with accepting foreign interference. If somebody offered your campaign dirt on either President Trump or a Democratic candidate, what would you do with that dirt?
You wouldn't do anything with that dirt. You would call the FBI. This isn't even
Would you even look at it?
Complicated.
Would you ever look at it?
No, you call the FBI. Look, the moment that you look at it, you have implicated yourself, and I don't think you would want to do that. Look, some things are complicated in politics and ethics. This is not. And this is not theoretical either. A hostile foreign power successfully attacked our democracy in the last election, and there's no indication that they're going to back off from trying to do it in the next election. That's why it's shocking to hear the president say what he said. Then again, he specializes in shocking us so that we can't talk about anything else. And I hope that while we are forcefully responding to the outrageous suggestion that he would do something illegal in that situation, it's not making us less able to talk about our own agenda of making Americans' lives better off, of delivering better wages, better living standards, health care, and all the other issues on which Americans trust the Democratic Party. He needs us talking about him so that we're not talking about voters, because when we talk about voters, we win. We will call out his wrongdoing and then return right to our message, because that's what's going to make for a better America all the way to the 2050s.
Have you thought about the fact that if you're the nominee, you're pledging to play by this one set of rules, The president has not, and he wins narrowly. Are you going to feel as if you can accept the results if you don't think the president played by the rules, didn't use the federal government unfairly, didn't use foreign interference? I mean, how do we convince the country this was a fair election?
The idea of fair elections is foundational to our democracy, and we know that our country has always been imperfect, and yet we run for office in the faith that running for office is worth it. We submit ourselves to the laws passed under the Constitution of this country in the faith that they can be fairly administered. And I am a presidential candidate in the faith that this process, this distinctly American process, will lead to a good outcome. What we absolutely cannot do is stoop to his level or believe somehow that we would need to embrace or emulate the very thing that we are fighting against politically. And while the playing field is not always level, we already know that because of things like gerrymandering and an electoral college that can overrule the American people when they agree with us. Nevertheless, we have to continue to work in a lawful way. And if one hand is tied behind our back, fight twice as hard, knowing that the American people are with us on most of the major issues and that will carry us in the end.
You responded to a question about this idea of prosecuting a former President Trump, possibly having a Justice Department look at the obstruction case. And you're basically open to this idea that if that's what the Justice Department says, then they should pursue it. How do you, if you're elected president, one of the reasons you got elected is you'd have convinced the country it's time to change the channel. How do you change the channel and prosecute the former president at the same time?
America can do many things at the same time, but it's not the president's job to prosecute a foreign president. Changing the channel means focusing on how we can make people's lives better. And if, in parallel, there are investigations going on into criminal behavior by people who were formerly at some of the highest levels in our government, so be it. That's how the justice system works. But the most important principle here is the independence of the judiciary. The independence of the DOJ is obviously not something this president respects. He's treated it like it ought to be his own personal law firm.
So this won't be a litmus test for your Attorney General. You would tell your Attorney General, look at it if you want to. I'm not going to tell you which way to come down on whether to prosecute the former president of the United States.
Prosecution decisions shouldn't be made by politicians in that sense. And what I will say is any Attorney General that I would appoint is somebody who will faithfully apply the concept that no one is above the law, that everybody ought to be held accountable, whether they are a former president or whether they are somebody who's never been anywhere near the halls of power. That's the whole point. It's that justice is blind. And I will appoint an Attorney General and, for that matter, justices and judges who uphold that principle.
If there is, final topic I want to get to is your ability to win this Democratic nomination in general. And if there is one whisper of you will, that Democrats have about your candidacy. Many are excited, but you hear the whisper, but, oh, I don't know, can he get African-American support? I want to read you a quote from the Reverend Roderick Reed that the Indianapolis Star interviewed. He's a pastor at the Uplift Church in Indianapolis. Here's what he said. I guarantee it's going to be an obstacle. This is about the fact that you're married to another man. I guarantee it's going to be an obstacle for the candidate from South Bend. That is really still a touchy subject, specifically and especially in the African-American church. Now, I think it could be overcome because we are gradually getting to a point of, and I don't want to say accept, but we are getting to a point of realizing this is the culture that we are going to have to begin to live with and adapt to it. I know you're trying to have these conversations with a lot of African-Americans. How are they going?
They're going well, and we are working very hard to engage people across the party, but especially black voters who expect you to demonstrate, especially when you're new on the scene, what your values are and how you're going to promote policies that lift them up. I also think we have a moment on our hands when we can do the exact opposite of what the president has done. The president has used identity as a wedge, used race as a wedge to divide people who have common interests. I think we have an opportunity to reach into our own distinctive identities and use them to build bridges, to reach out to people different from us, knowing that anybody who has been on the short end of an equation of exclusion has a way to sympathize with people who've had different experiences with exclusion in this country. And if we build a solidarity around that, then people who have, for whatever reason, felt a lack of belonging or felt exclusion or felt discrimination in this country, even though those patterns of discrimination are very, very different, When all of us come together, we win, and we are all better off.
But I do want to follow up. I've talked to African-American congressmen who really like you and want to support you, where some of their more conservative, religious-minded constituents who vote straight-ticket Democrat most of the time would have trouble voting for you. What do you say to those politicians in Washington who want to get behind your candidacy but are nervous about this?
I'd invite them to look at what happened in South Bend. I'm from a socially conservative community. When I came out, we didn't know what the effects would be. It was actually during an election year. Mike Pence was the governor of our state. He was popular at the time. And what happened was I won with 80% of the vote. What that tells you, I think, is that people, if you give them a chance, will evaluate you based on what you aim to do, what the results are, what the policies are. And I have every confidence that American voters, especially Democratic voters, will not discriminate when the opportunity comes up to choose the right leader for the future.
Pete Buttigieg, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your views with us, and stay safe on the trail.
Thank you.